I'd like to welcome you to this very special chapel that we are having tonight on a Christian perspective on globalization. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Philip Massey. I am a professor here in the School of Business, teaching finance and accounting courses. I'd like to start by explaining how tonight's chapel came about. This is actually the second half of my finance course for this evening, and tonight we were coming to the final chapter in our textbook dealing with the subject of international finance. When I had written my lesson plans over the summer, I had originally intended to cover the material that's in our textbook pertaining to foreign currency transactions and exchange rates and things like that. However, one of the things that I do at the beginning of every semester is that I have one-on-one meetings with each of my new students as a way of helping me get to know them. So during one such meeting, these are usually about 10 to 15-minute meetings, during one such meeting, I had a student ask me a couple of questions pertaining to globalization. So I gave some initial responses to these questions, but after that meeting, I began to think that the questions I was being asked were really important questions, and to try to answer them in 5 minutes just would not do justice to these types of issues. So I asked the student to write out for me in an email all of the questions so that I could then begin to think about how I could incorporate a full-length discussion of these issues. And so that's how tonight's session came about. This student has given me permission to read the email that I received so that you know what are some of the issues that prompted this discussion. So here is the student's email. Professor Massey, apologies for the not-so-prompt reply. I tried to write out some concise questions, but ended up with what follows. Please let me know if these thoughts or questions don't make sense, and forgive my ignorance where knowledge is lacking. I am most interested in the ethics of globalization. Obviously, as Christians, we seek an ordering of the world that is different than what it is now. When we pray God's kingdom come, I understand that this is because not all is right in the world, and Jesus instructs us to live in such a way that we are steeped in the reality of a different kingdom. This kingdom is one in which there is freedom from oppression, healing of disease, forgiveness of sin, and the love of God and neighbor. It is God's vision for shalom. It reaches individuals, communities, societal structures, the whole of creation. God plans to renew it all. Those aren't really questions, I suppose, as much as they are the basis from which I'll ask my questions. The kingdom, in its tension between already and not yet, provides a critical edge to all existing relationships within the cosmos. So my first question involves a look at what sort of order we see in our globalized world. Who makes the decisions and who gets to follow? The second involves questions of value. What is valued and what gets tossed to the wayside? How do these orders and values align with God's vision for the world, and where do they diverge? I will bring up some issues related to these questions. Order. Does any part of the present order exploit or oppress? This is the sweatshop, sweatfield question. It also requires a look at the history of globalization, something I'm trying to learn about. I'm wondering what impact past and present violences, colonialism, neocolonialism, globalization, have had on the current gap between First World and Third World. Some advocates of purely free trade will argue that free does not mean equal, and that everyone does not need to start at the same place for things to be fair. However, I'm not so sure that's the case when there have been long histories of oppression and exploitation. How do we know these histories have ceased to be present realities? Karl Marx was wrong in his view of history because, one, he was a materialist, and two, he thought that the bourgeoisie always got rich at the expense of the poor. When Jay Richards spoke last semester, I realized that there could be win-wins in the free market. But I wonder if this is the exception rather than the rule in a race that has fallen so short of the mark. Questions on wealth. capitalism says wealth can be created, and rightly so, since we are created in God's image. But what's funny is that the best definition given for wealth is some subjective measurement of how something else contributes to your well-being or happiness. It must be ironic then that there is a strong positive correlation between the depression rates of a country and how developed it is. Are developed countries happier? Counterpoint: increased healthcare, more pleasant sanitary living conditions, greater abundance and variety of food in developed countries would appear to make them happier places. Then we get to go back into ethics and ask what happiness is and what constitutes human flourishing and how development increases or diminishes our ability to flourish in ways that God intended. Counter to the counterpoint: the developed world's pornography, divorce rates, fragmentation of the family unit, and increased isolation of the individual in some ways lower the quality of life because life is not enjoyed as such. Then we must ask about the dangers in exporting the values of developed countries onto others, and to some degree the inevitability of this given the information age. Ironically, I have unarticulated questions about languages. Is it good or bad that the amount of languages in the world are drastically diminishing? Possibilities for ill or good, implications. Babel or the Tower of, similar questions about chain stores spreading everywhere. Diversity versus uniformity and the values of both. Also, concerning the world being flat, as Friedman says, what possibilities for peace are present in a global community? How might these levelers diminish some historical injustices? At the same time, whenever one group perceives they have been wronged or oppressed by another, the natural reaction is to rise up and take that eye for an eye, i.e. the Taliban. Given the animosities present between classes, countries, worlds, how might globalization allow for a flattening that encourages more discord than union? God's creation. Forgive me for being too critical on this one. Once we step out of escape pod theology that we get to fly away, so let's treat the earth like a giant garbage can, creation care becomes a serious issue for Christians to think about. The question should not be directed at if the world is cooling or heating, or if we are making an impact on it. Rather, it should be, are we treating the planet in a way that is befitting to a beautiful gift from God, or are we treating it as merely a means to the end of our personal enjoyment? I say merely a means because in many ways the earth is a means to our ability to eat, clothe ourselves, enjoy life. And God made enough of it for that. But the earth is also something to be enjoyed for what it is, apart from what we get from it. Humans have always used the earth for so many things, sometimes harming other forms of life and sometimes living harmoniously with other living things. But since population has been relatively small for much of the Earth's history, impact has likewise been relatively small. I think it is foolish to think that such a large population has little impact on other creatures and forms of life living on this planet. I also wonder the ethics of when use becomes abuse, when our wants get turned into needs at the expense of tarnishing a great prize. My last question is not necessarily on globalization, but actually about what you said last Wednesday in class and mentioned again in our meeting Friday. You said that businesses that act unethically do not do well in the long run, but businesses that act ethically in their financial practices do well in the end, if I understood you correctly. I wonder if this is too optimistic given the current state of affairs. I respond with the age-old question of why do the wicked prosper? It seems that here in this life, many Enrons and Freddie Macs are just too smart to get caught and never do. And sometimes companies with God-fearing owners and ethical practices don't make the cut. I'm not saying one needs to act unethically to succeed, merely wondering if it is so black and white. Apologies for being neither concise nor precise. Still wading through a lot of new information for me and too many questions to go with it. I really think that the changes seen in the globalized world are not to be open-heartedly accepted by Christians without any questioning, nor should everything new be regarded as evil. What drives me crazy is the "it is what it is" mentality that say that systems can be neither good nor bad, and we should just go along with it all. That's why I think it's important to think in terms of God's kingdom. Well, you asked for all of my questions, and I'm sure I have more because this issue is kind of broad. If you have a minute, I'd love to hear what you think on some of these issues and some of the weaknesses in my questions and thoughts. I would really appreciate that, and I'm excited to see how a discussion on globalization would go in our class later this semester. This is one of the most profound emails I've ever received from a student, and addressing every single one of those questions could really be an entire course in its own right. I have 1 hour to speak to you on this subject tonight, so by necessity we will only be scratching the surface of a couple of these questions. But in the words of Fox News, I will strive to be fair and balanced and present both sides of the questions that we will be covering. And as this is an important set of issues for us to think about in terms of our role and responsibility as Christians, I think it is appropriate that we should begin with a word of prayer. Father God, we seek as your sons and daughters to be your agents here on this earth and to think about the issues that we see around us and confront them in a way that brings glory and honor to you. We seek to be responsible stewards of that which you have entrusted to us. And so as we look into some of these questions tonight, we pray that you would give us understanding hearts and minds and help us to think about what our role in response to some of these questions would be. In Jesus' name, amen. As we begin this discussion, one of the things that I'd like to do is to read a commentary by Chuck Colson to help us frame some of the manners in which we will be looking at trying to understand these issues. Chuck Colson is one of my favorite commentators. He is the founder of Prison Fellowship Ministries. But the reason I like him so much is that he is truly someone who embodies what it means to think about issues from the standpoint of a Christian worldview. Whether it be in the area of politics or bioethics or business, you name it, just about any issue, Chuck Colson always finds a way to be able to think about that from the standpoint of a Christian worldview. So in 1998, Chuck Colson wrote a classic commentary called Three-Legged Stools: Why Commerce Needs Morality. And I think this is an excellent way to frame our discussion tonight. As we draw closer to the fall elections, we hear continued rumblings in the press of a major crack-up in the Republican Party. Moral conservatives, mostly Christians, are going toe-to-toe with economic conservatives over issues like abortion and religious freedom. Party strategists are wringing their hands. The religious right is causing near civil war, warns an article in the Arizona Republic. The Kansas City Star calls it a debate between morality and commerce. What few seem to realize is that the two sides have no business battling one another. Commerce needs morality. This so-called war broke out when the House of Representatives passed the Freedom from Religious Persecution Act. The bill curbs non-humanitarian aid to countries that torture, imprison, and kill religious believers. Howls of protest went up from the business leaders who hinted darkly they might cut their historic ties to the GOP. Conservative think tanks weighed in against the bill, and a new potent business lobby was formed called USA Engage with more than 600 members including IBM, Boeing, and Mobil. But this war between the two sides is dangerous, not just because it threatens a bill to protect the persecuted church, but also because it threatens the very foundation of free democratic government. It's a false dichotomy that many politicians and business leaders seem to have accepted. Morality is not opposed to commerce. It's a crucial support. Let me say that one more time. Morality is not opposed to commerce. It's a crucial support. Businesses thrive best in cultures that are both politically free and morally virtuous. As Michael Novak has eloquently argued, Western democracy is like a three-legged stool. It comprises political liberty, economic freedom, and moral responsibility. Weaken any leg and the stool topples over. This means it's in business leaders' own interest to support sanctions against a regime that practices persecution, because repression is not only bad for religion, it's also bad for free government and obviously bad for business. USA Engage argues that trade itself can foster freedom, that trade will loosen up repressive regimes and nudge them toward democracy. Well, true as far as it goes. And that's why the Freedom from Religious Persecution Act doesn't deal with trade, but with foreign aid, i.e. not private investment dollars, but taxpayer dollars channeled through the government. If enacted, and the bill was enacted, the bill would announce to the world that the American government refuses to give moral approval to cutthroat regimes that practice religious persecution. Now, the thugs in China or the Sudan who are putting Christians behind bars and selling them into slavery might not like our stand. But in the long run, it is better for everyone, not only for moral conservatives who care about religious liberty, but also for businesses who see these nations as potential trading partners. A freer nation means more prosperity, better trade. The press keeps up the drumbeat, warning of a warfare threatening to split the GOP, casting the religious right as the culprit. Well, Christians ought to turn the tables, teaching the GOP and the Democrats too a basic lesson about American liberal democracy, that it requires policies that strengthen all three legs of Michael Novak's stool. It is time to stop demonizing moral issues and start embracing them. Christians aren't the enemy as the press makes us. We are the ones insisting on moral virtue, without which our political and economic freedoms would soon be lost. I think Chuck Colson has it exactly right in explaining that there is an inseparable link between morality and commerce. So one of the first questions that my student asked me had to do with the ethics of globalization. Does any part of the order exploit or oppress? As we seek to address this first question, I think it is helpful for us to look at both what are some of the positive contributions as well as maybe some of the caution and pitfalls that we need to be aware of pertaining to globalization. So let's begin with some of the positive contributions. One of the most undeniable aspects of globalization is that we have seen in third world countries the rise of a middle class in those countries. Historically, in many of these countries, they have been characterized by a very small aristocratic elite and a very large working class population. If you've seen the film Slumdog Millionaire, then you will remember the stark contrast between the absolute squalor that was portrayed in that region of India versus the absolutely opulent, lavish lifestyle of the crime boss, Javed, in that film. And so how often have we heard of the wealthy exploiting the poor for their own selfish ends? And the poor have historically been powerless to do anything about such injustice, and they've had no hope of ever escaping their poverty. However, globalization has begun to change that quite dramatically. As third world countries have begun to liberalize their economies and open up to Western companies, these Western companies have come into those countries and have begun to create good-paying jobs, which, although they may not be at the same pay scale as they would be in their domestic countries, are nevertheless a substantial improvement over the meager wage subsistence-level jobs that would have typically been available to many people in that part of the world. And so because of these good-paying jobs that Western companies are bringing into third world countries, we are seeing that the living standards of the population are definitely rising. Although you may still have certain regions of various countries where you do have families and individuals working in subsistence level jobs, you now also have a significant portion of the population that has the opportunity to go to school, receive an education, learn a good industry and skill, and actually find good paying jobs in that skill that doesn't require working 18 hours a day. Now, since I am from India, let me just speak anecdotally about some of the ways in which we can see this playing out in a country like India. My father grew up in, by Indian standards, a fairly affluent family. His father worked for the government and had a good paying job that enabled him to send my father and all 5 of his sisters to some of the most prestigious private Catholic schools in New Delhi. But as affluent as my father's family was, there was no such thing as a family car when my dad was growing up. Men in that era might possibly have had a motorbike, but if you wanted to travel somewhere as a family, you took a bus or rode in a taxi or perhaps even rode in a rickshaw. So having a family car just was not something that many families would have thought possible in that era, and for sure having 2 cars in one family would have been beyond anyone's imagination. But now, when I go to visit India and visit some of my cousins there, I can see that many of them do in fact have 2 cars in one family. Now, the question of whether the roads of India were designed to handle that much traffic is quite another question. But the basic point remains that having 1 car or even 2 cars in a family is no longer something that would be considered unimaginable for many Indian families. Also, my cousins are able to take vacations in foreign countries, go to Europe or other places. And this again, traveling to foreign countries on vacation is a luxury that simply would have been unimaginable in previous generations. Let's take a second example and consider something as basic as a cell phone. According to a market research company called iSupply, they project that by the year 2014, 97% of India's population of 1.25 billion people will have a cell phone. Let me just write these numbers on the board, and I'll put these in thousands of millions so that you don't get lost in all of the zeros. So what is the total population of India? The total population is 1,250 million people. 4 times the entire US. This company said that 97% of this population would have a cell phone. I think it's easier to think about what 3% that won't have a cell phone is. So the number that won't have a cell phone. This would be 37.5 million, which is approximately the population of California. So basically, what this company is saying is that in a country like India that has a total population of 4 times the entire United States, the number of people that will not have a cell phone 4 years from now is only equal to the population of California. So you can see just how great that penetration of cell phones is. Now, here in the US, we often tend to think of cell phones as a convenience, and to some degree that is the case in India as well. But if you truly want to appreciate the significance of a 97% market penetration of cell phones, you have to understand that this obviously means even the very poor and working class population have cell phones. Why is this important? You may have heard of a term called microlending. Microlending refers to a program where small business loans are made to people in third world countries, in rural areas especially, and oftentimes these are women, who show some intuitive ability of being able to run an entrepreneurial business. And so because of these small business loans that are made to these micro entrepreneurs, they are able to establish businesses within their own communities that help them to escape and aspire to something more than just a subsistence standard of living. So for these micro entrepreneurs, having a cell phone is absolutely indispensable to being able to run their businesses. And so that's why this number is so significant in terms of explaining the level of market penetration for something like a cell phone. Now, I have not even begun to discuss the impact that technology is starting to have in undermining autocratic regimes. Regimes in places like China and Iran are finding it increasingly difficult to censor the information that their citizens can receive. Since they do allow their citizens to have cell phones, if you can text or tweet with people around the world and receive information that your government is censoring from you, then that can only embolden the fight for liberty and democracy in these types of countries. And so at some point, I believe that it will simply not be possible for these autocratic regimes to continue oppressing their people without a huge uprising of protest that eventually, I think, would pave the way for these countries to be forced to opening up their political systems. So these are some of the ways in which we can clearly see that globalization has had a positive contribution. But now let's think about what are some of the potential pitfalls that we need to be concerned about. In the commentary that I read by Chuck Colson, his fundamental point was that commerce needs morality. Commerce without morality leads to loss of freedom politically, economically, and religiously. So then the main question that we have to be concerned about with globalization is whether companies are using it as a way of escaping from this pesky little thing known as moral constraints. This is especially true if you are conducting businesses in countries that do not have a strong rule of law or protection of human rights and things like that. So one of the most obvious examples of this is in the whole question of sweatshop labor, and one of the companies that has been most embroiled in that controversy has been Nike. According to a paper by Richard M. Locke of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, here's what he said about Nike and the sweatshop controversy. The same factors that permitted Nike to grow at an impressive rate over the last several decades, taking advantage of global sourcing opportunities to produce lower-cost products and investing these savings into innovative designs and marketing campaigns, have also created serious problems for the company in recent years. Already in the 1980s, Nike had been criticized for sourcing its products in factories and countries where low wages, poor working conditions, and human rights problems were rampant. However, over the course of the 1990s, a series of public relations nightmares involving underpaid workers in Indonesia, child labor in Cambodia and Pakistan, and poor working conditions in China and Vietnam combined to tarnish Nike's image. As Phil Knight lamented in a May 1998 speech to the National Press Club, the Nike product has become synonymous with slave wages, forced overtime, and arbitrary abuse. A couple of examples. First of all, in the early 1990s, Nike products were being manufactured in 6 Indonesian factories employing more than 25,000 workers. 4 of these factories were owned by Nike's Korean suppliers. As Nike's presence in Indonesia increased, the factories supplying its products, about 6 million pairs of shoes per year, came under greater scrutiny. Reports by a variety of NGOs and labor activists claimed that these plants were rife with exploitation, poor working conditions, and a range of human rights and labor abuses. Many Indonesian shoe factories did not even pay the minimum daily wage, at the time 2,100 rupiah, or about $1 per day. They petitioned the Indonesian government for exemptions to the legal minimum wage, claiming it would cause them hardship to pay. A second example, the city of Sialkot, Pakistan, is home to a cluster of small and medium-sized firms specializing in an array of labor-intensive export-oriented goods, including hand-stitched soccer balls. About 70% of the world's high-quality soccer balls are produced in Sialkot, many of them for leading brands like Reebok, Nike, Mitre, and Adidas. In June 1996, Life magazine published an article on child labor in Pakistan, which included a photo of a 12-year-old boy stitching a Nike soccer ball. This article and its accompanying photo unleashed another wave of criticism against Nike and a call by various consumer groups, trade unions, and NGOs to boycott Sialkot-produced soccer balls. According to Maria Eitel, Vice President and Senior Advisor for Corporate Responsibility at Nike, this represented a critical event for the company in terms of its understanding of globalization, international labor standards, and corporate responsibility. In response to the wave of criticisms generated by this episode, the Sialkot Chamber of Commerce and Industry signed the so-called Atlanta Agreement with the ILO, UNICEF, and several leading sports goods associations to implement a program to eliminate child labor from the soccer ball sector. As a result of the Atlanta Agreement, the ILO's International Program for the Elimination of Child Labor, IPEC, arrived in Sialkot to monitor local soccer ball producers and to provide various social protections, training, and other income-generating activities for families whose children used to work in stitching plants. Nike insists that any of its contractors caught employing child workers must remove the child from the factory, continue to pay the child's wages, and pay for the child's school fees until he or she reaches legal working age. Yet notwithstanding the arrival of IPEC and Nike's new child labor policies, the ILO reports that many local employers continue to use children in their stitching centers, and that in response to increased monitoring of standards in Sialkot, some soccer ball production has moved to other nearby but less regulated areas of Pakistan. I think these examples highlight exactly the very real dangers that companies can face as they contract with producers in third world countries where their business practices are less scrupulous. And this, I think, is exactly what Chuck Colson was talking about in his discussion of morality and commerce. To me, it is no accident that generally speaking, the Western countries that have strong protection of human rights and the rule of law are the ones where you generally find a strong Christian heritage. And to me, it is no accident that the third world countries without strong protections of human rights and the rule of law are the ones where there's often a weak or non-existent Christian heritage. In the Christian worldview, especially as espoused by the Puritans, work is pleasing to God because it is a reflection of his own character in working 6 days to create the universe. There's another commentary Chuck Colson wrote on this point. This one is called In Celebration of Labor, the Value of a Good Day's Work. Christians have a special reason to celebrate Labor Day, which honors the fundamental dignity of workers, for we worship a God who labored to make the world and who created human beings in his image to be his workers. When God made Adam and Eve, he gave them work to do, cultivating and caring for the earth. In the ancient world, the Greeks and Romans looked upon manual work as a curse, something for lower classes and slaves. But Christianity changed all of that. Christians viewed work as a high calling, a calling to be co-workers with God in unfolding the rich potential of his creation. This high view of work can be traced throughout the history of the church. In the Middle Ages, the Guild movement grew out of the church. It set standards for good workmanship and encouraged members to take satisfaction in the results of their labor. The guilds became the forerunner of the modern labor movement. Later, during the Reformation, Martin Luther preached that all work should be done to the glory of God. Whether ministering the gospel or scrubbing floors, any honest work is pleasing to the Lord. Out of this conviction grew the Protestant work ethic. Christians were also active on behalf of workers in the early days of the Industrial Revolution, when factories were dark satanic mills, to borrow a phrase from Sir William Blake. In those days, work in factories and coal mines was hard and dangerous. Men, women, and children were practically slaves, sometimes even chained to machines. Then John Wesley came preaching and teaching the gospel throughout England. He came not to the upper classes, but to the laboring classes, to men whose faces were black with coal dust, women whose dresses were patched and faded. John Wesley preached to them, and in the process he pricked the conscience of the whole nation. Two of Wesley's disciples, William Wilberforce and Lord Shaftesbury, were inspired to work for legislation that would clean up abuses in the workplace. At their urging, the British Parliament passed child labour laws, safety laws, and minimum wage laws. I think this is as good an illustration as any of the inseparable link between morality and commerce. Nations that are strongly infused with this type of a Christian heritage are the ones where exploitation is generally kept to a minimum, whereas exploitation is highest in those nations that lack this kind of a Christian ethical foundation. Now, a second area of concern with globalization is not only its possible exploitation of third world countries, but also its possible impact to displaced employees domestically whose jobs are then sent overseas. Now, to be fair, we should recognize that job displacement has always historically accompanied any sort of technological progress. I have one example that I'd like to show you, Chad, if you could please put the slide on the screen. This is a grain harvesting combine. And I asked a couple of friends of mine who come from farming backgrounds what the impact of a machine such as this was on farm labor. So they told me that one person driving a machine such as this can harvest approximately 100 acres of wheat in a single day. Before the invention of a machine such as this, horse-drawn combines could at most have harvested about 10 acres in a single day, and those horse-drawn combines would have required not one person, but multiple people actually to operate them. So you have a twofold effect then on job displacement. One is that this one machine driven by one person can do 10 times as much crop area in a day as horse-drawn combines could, but then also the fact that it only takes one person instead of an entire team of people to operate these horse-drawn combines. So obviously we can see that this has had a substantial impact on job displacement in the farm sector, but at the same time we can definitely see that because of inventions such as this, we now have a much greater ability to produce food that feeds the world and has reduced things like malnutrition and starvation in third world countries. So on the whole, I think we would definitely say that even though this did have job displacement in the farm sector, overall, this has been a positive development. Thank you, Chad. So this ongoing cycle of new technologies causing displacement in old technologies is simply a fact of life to which we must constantly adapt. In light of this, is it appropriate for companies to send certain categories of jobs to lower wage countries overseas? And if so, what are their social responsibilities to displaced employees domestically? Adam Smith wrote in his book, The Wealth of Nations, that each country should specialize in the manufacture and export of products or services that can be most efficiently produced in that country. And so if one country has an inclination, either by virtue of its natural resources or perhaps the particular skills and abilities of its citizens, to specialize in something, it should do so. For a country to try to do something in which it did not have either the natural resources or the abilities of its citizens would actually result in inefficiency and loss of quality both for the producer as well as for the consumer. So as applied to a country such as the US, I believe that the US should equip its domestic employees to perform those job functions in which the US has the best qualifications and resources, and then it should allow other countries to perform those functions in which those countries have the best qualifications and resources. Let's just take one common and familiar example of this, computer call centers. Referring again to the film Slumdog Millionaire, we saw how computer call centers were a part of the storyline in that film. So we might ask the question, why is it that India seems to be such a global hub for computer call centers? Well, the culture of India has for decades stressed to its citizens that if they are going to pursue higher education, they should choose as their fields of study what we would typically call the hard sciences: physics, engineering, mathematics, biology, chemistry, medicine, and computer science. And so as a result of this, India has developed a fairly strong competency in all of these disciplines, including computer science. Now, in earlier times, if people in India who had studied in these fields wanted to get jobs, they would actually have to emigrate to other countries because the job opportunities within India itself were fairly limited. But with globalization, and with what Thomas Friedman refers to as the world is flat, Indians no longer need to travel overseas and leave behind their own families and communities to find good-paying jobs in these fields. Because of globalization, these jobs are now available in their own communities, and US companies have recognized that this provides a huge opportunity to tap into the natural skills that employees in countries like India have in all of these fields, such as computer science. So where does this leave US employees? After all, if you've trained in computer science and you know how to be a computer tech agent, surely you would like to do that for a living as well. So should companies just say, sorry, it's cheaper for us to have India and other countries do these jobs, and so we'll just have to get rid of your job? No, I don't think that would be consistent with companies' social and moral responsibility to their employees. If a company is going to transfer a certain category of jobs to a lower wage third world country, then I believe at a minimum it should provide its domestic employees the opportunities to be trained in new skills that will be available in the domestic countries. I think sometimes it is the case that one of the reasons companies look to move a certain category of jobs overseas is they believe that the cost savings from doing so will enable them to pursue new business initiatives that previously would have been unaffordable had they not transferred this category of jobs to a lower wage country. So if that is the case, then I believe companies should provide their employees the opportunity to become trained in whatever these new business initiatives are going to be. If companies take that responsibility seriously, then I think globalization can be a win-win, because on the one hand, in the third world countries, you will have new job opportunities that never existed before and which raise the standard of living for people in those countries. But then domestically, we now have employees who were previously skilled in one thing. Now they are being skilled in something entirely new, which enables them to be even more valuable as employees. But we do have to be careful that if companies only focus on the pure cost savings aspect without any regard for the welfare of employees, then this is where we can see some of the dangers of globalization and exploitation. A second question that my student asked me had to do with the world is flat. Is this an opportunity for global peace or global discord? So in 2005, New York Times journalist Thomas Friedman wrote a book called The World is Flat. And his basic thesis was that there were 10 flatteners, as he referred to them. These are developments in technology and business processes that have significantly reduced the impact of national boundaries in terms of our ability to interact with people around the world and get things done. And so because of these 10 flatteners, things that were previously difficult or impossible to do as a result of government-imposed restrictions are now actually quite easy to do. I won't go into all 10 of these, but let me just highlight for you a few of the key ones that Friedman lists. Number 2, Netscape, August 9th, 1995. Netscape went public at the price of $28. Netscape and the web broadened the audience for the internet from its roots as a communications medium used primarily by early adopters and geeks to something that made the internet accessible to everyone from 5-year-olds to 95-year-olds. The digitization that took place meant that everyday occurrences such as words, files, films, music, and pictures could be accessed and manipulated on a computer screen by all people across the world. Number 4, outsourcing. Friedman argues that outsourcing has allowed companies to split service and manufacturing activities into components which can be subcontracted and performed in the most efficient, cost-effective way. This process became easier with the mass distribution of fiber optic cables during the introduction of the World Wide Web. Number 5, offshoring. The internal relocation of a company's manufacturing or other processes to a foreign land to take advantage of less costly operations there. China's entrance into the World Trade Organization allowed for greater competition in the playing field. Now, countries such as Malaysia, Mexico, and Brazil must compete against China and each other to have businesses offshore to them. Number 6, open source. Communities uploading and collaborating on online projects. Examples include open source software, blogs, and Wikipedia. Friedman considers this phenomenon the most disruptive force of all. Number 10, the steroids, wireless, voice over internet, and file sharing. Personal digital devices like mobile phones, iPods, personal digital assistants, instant messaging, and voice over internet protocol, VoIP. Digital, mobile, personal, and virtual, all analog content and processes, from entertainment to photography to word processing, can be digitized and therefore shaped, manipulated, and transmitted. Virtual, these processes can be done at high speed with total ease. Mobile can be done anywhere, anytime, by anyone. And personal can be done by you. So as we think about some of these flatteners, let's begin by exploring what are some of the ways that these flatteners create a potential for global peace. Now, as Christians, we recognize that the world will never truly be at peace until the Lord Jesus Christ himself returns to rule and reign here on this earth. Nevertheless, he has told us in no uncertain terms that we are to be his agents to do good on this earth until he comes. So can a flattening world be a tool toward this end? Now, one of the things Friedman listed in this list of flatteners is what he called the steroids, including things like mobile phones and iPods. So I have already talked about how smartphone technology is making it increasingly difficult for autocratic governments to censor the information that their citizens can receive. So I think in this respect, a flattening world has been very beneficial to the cause of advancing democracy and liberty in some of these regions of the world. Very few governments really want to go to the extreme of being a prison state like North Korea. China, for example, wants to be a major player in the world's economy, and it wants its citizens to enjoy Western notions of prosperity. But as Chuck Colson said in his Three-Legged Stools commentary, moral virtue is inextricably linked with economic and political freedom. And so in the long run, countries like China cannot truly allow their citizens to enjoy the full benefits of all of these freedoms unless they liberalize their political structure. One of the members of Biola's board of trustees is a longtime family friend by the name of Pramod Haq. Pramod is a venture capitalist in the San Jose area, and since he also is from India, he often travels there on business. So during a recent visit that he had when he was down here, he was telling me something quite interesting. He quoted someone that was saying that when evaluating the long-term prospects of China versus India, this person thought India would eventually emerge as the winner. And he used the following analogy. He said that in China, the roads are smooth now, but they will have potholes down the road. In India, the roads have potholes now, but they will be smooth later on. Now, both of these countries, India and China, could arguably be the most notable examples of a flattening world. So why did this business expert that Pramod quoted believe that they would have different outcomes? He said that in China, the government just does things by diktat without getting the consent and buy-in of its citizens. So as an example, the Beijing Olympics were China's opportunity to showcase to the world its ability to pull off a large-scale international event competently. But what was less reported was the extent to which the government just seized land and other resources from its citizens to get this done. India, by contrast, is a democracy. You do occasionally have issues with corruption and bribery, but it is nevertheless a democracy. And for the government in India to get things done, it needs to have the support of its citizens. If the citizens are not on board with what it is that the government is trying to do, then they can and will vote out of office the people who are pushing these unpopular policies. And so China may look good now, but if it continues to use strong-arm tactics, then it will breed resentment amongst its citizens that will have unhealthy effects in the long run. India, on the other hand, may be a little bit messy now, but because it has to get the consent and approval of its citizens, the long-term prospects for India are significantly better. Now, how else might a flattening world be an opportunity for global peace? I mentioned that one of the most notable aspects of globalization is that as a result of outsourcing, jobs are now available to people in their countries within their own communities. And so they no longer have to uproot themselves, leave behind their families, and emigrate to another country. They can get these jobs right where they are. So this has obvious benefits for societal cohesion. First of all, they can remain in their own cultures and not have to adapt to a new one. Secondly, they can continue to enjoy strong family relationships with their extended family. Thirdly, governments and nations don't have to worry as much about what we call the brain drain effect, where they are losing their best talent to other countries overseas. And then fourthly, as we've talked about, the rise in living standards that has affected not only the creation of a middle class, but is also then increasing the living standards of the rest of the population. So as John F. Kennedy once famously said, that a rising tide lifts all boats. So these are some of the ways in which we can see that a flattening world has potential benefits for global peace. But we cannot ignore the ways in which it can also have the potential for global discord. One of the sad realities in life is that evil always finds a way to debase and corrupt those things that were originally intended for good. We can see this as early as the fall in Genesis 3, where God had created a perfect world for Adam and Eve, and yet Satan induced them into sinning and thus ruining God's very good creation. I'm reminded of a rather humorous take on this story that I once received in an email. It's called God Created and Satan Created. So here's how the story goes. God created the heavens and the earth, and populated the earth with broccoli and cauliflower, spinach, and green, yellow, and red vegetables of all kinds, so man and woman would live long and healthy lives. Then, using God's great gifts, Satan created Ben & Jerry's and Krispy Kreme donuts. And Satan said, "You want chocolate with that?" And man said, "Yeah." And woman said, "And another one with sprinkles." And they gained 10 to 20 pounds. And God created the healthy yogurt, that woman might keep the figure that man found so fair. And Satan brought forth white flour from the wheat and sugar from the cane and combined them, and their waists expanded. So God said, "Try my fresh green salad." And Satan presented Thousand Island dressing and garlic toast on the side. And man and woman unfastened their belts following the repast. God then said, "I have sent you heart-healthy vegetables and olive oil in which to cook them." And Satan brought forth deep-fried fish and chicken-fried steak so big it needed its own platter. And man gained more weight, and his cholesterol went through the roof. God then brought forth running shoes, so that his children might lose those extra pounds. And Satan gave cable TV with a remote control, so man would not have to get up to change the channels. And man and woman laughed and cried before the flickering light and gained pounds. Then God brought forth the potato, naturally low in fat and brimming with nutrition. And Satan peeled off the healthful skin, sliced the starchy center into chips, and deep-fried them. and man gained pounds. God then gave lean beef so that man might consume fewer calories and still satisfy his appetite. And Satan created the 99-cent cheeseburger. Then he said, "You want fries with that?" And man replied, "Yeah, and supersize them." And Satan said, "It is good." And man went into cardiac arrest. God sighed and created quadruple bypass surgery. Then Satan created HMOs. So we laugh at this story, but it vividly illustrates the point that things intended for good can quickly be corrupted and become things that are used for evil. And so what are some of the ways that we see this in a flattened world? Let's start with perhaps one of the most obvious examples, the internet. Friedman listed this as one of the 10 flatteners when he mentioned Netscape. And so the internet began as a revolutionary way to share information around the world, especially with resources like Wikipedia and Google Books. Information that was previously only available in local libraries can now be digitized and uploaded and shared with anyone around the world. But this same technology that allows for information to be digitized and shared around the world can be a double-edged sword, as we've seen in the last few days with this whole WikiLeaks scandal, where sensitive government information has been leaked onto a website. And so 40 years ago, when there was an anti-Vietnam War activist who wanted to leak information about the Vietnam War, known as the Pentagon Papers, he had to go to the New York Times and see if they would be willing to publish the information that he had. Had the New York Times and other major newspapers not been willing to publish this person's information, then the Pentagon Papers never would have become public knowledge. It would have been highly difficult for him to find a forum where people could actually get a hold of his information. But now with WikiLeaks, who needs the New York Times? You can just upload this to a website and that information is out there for anyone to access. Let's take a look at another example of the internet, and one that is perhaps a little more pertinent to us, maybe one that you may know people who have been affected by this even, which is that we have tragically seen how the internet can be used for absolutely the most vile and reprehensible sexual content imaginable. Before the invention of the internet, if people wanted to gratify the lust of the flesh in this way, they had to go surreptitiously to places that provided this type of material. But sadly, the internet has completely decimated all such restraints and inhibitions on people's ability to engage in this type of carnality. So who needs to go to an adult bookstore or to a gentleman's club when you can get that same information right on your own computer in your own home? And so how many marriages have been destroyed by this, and how many addictions have been created by this twisted use of technology? And so I touch on this issue because all of you are at the stage of life where you will be forming habits for good or for ill that will generally stay with you as you mature. Here at Biola, you have filtered internet, but you will not always have that protection to rely upon. And so especially to you men, I give you this charge, and I say this with as much tenderness and compassion as I possibly can, that for the sake of your future marriages, if internet sexual addiction is even remotely a struggle for any of you, please do whatever it takes to make sure that you have accountability in this area of your life. I am not overstating the case when I say that this is a battle for your very eternal souls. I have been an accountability partner to Biola men in this area, and if you don't have anyone else that you feel would be appropriate, I would be more than happy to walk that journey with you, but please make sure that you do have someone who is willing to walk that journey if this is an issue for you. How else can we see the effects of a flattening world as a source of global discord? One example that we have seen recently is in Europe's attempts to cope with the fallout of member states that have been on the brink of fiscal insolvency. And so we saw how Greece required a bailout from the EU because it was on the brink of fiscal insolvency, and now just recently, Ireland also has needed a bailout. And so although the concept of the euro was to have a common currency for a common economic community, this aspect of a flattening world has not been without its difficulties and challenges. And so people in those euro countries that have pursued prudent fiscal policies are in many ways quite resentful over having to bail out these other countries that have pursued imprudent fiscal policies. I was just reading about this in the Wall Street Journal last week. Germany, as Europe's biggest nation, its citizens are very, very upset about having to engage in this sort of bailout of the other EU nations. So here again, we can see the potential for resentment and discord. Lastly, we know from the book of Revelation that eventually the entire world will unite under the leadership of a global ruler known as the Antichrist. I will not get into speculations about whether single regional currencies such as the euro and some of the other flatteners that we have talked about will be what eventually paves the way for this to happen. As Christians, we are called to redeem the world, redeem the culture, and use the influences that we see around us for good. So I think our major lesson from all of this discussion is that we should not necessarily oppose globalization, but neither should we uncritically accept all that it entails. As with almost anything else in life, we need discernment to be able to distinguish between those elements that are healthy and good and those elements that are destructive and harmful. So thank you so much for letting me speak to you on this topic tonight. And now I'd like to open it up to all of you for comments, questions, discussion. So please state your name and what it is that you are studying. No one has any questions? Yes, Chad.
Right. I'm Chad. I'm studying international business. You mentioned that you believe that Adam Smith's idea of comparative advantage is a good part and kind of a pillar of the emerging global world, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as we pursue that, I think like a country like Ghana, for example, who is very, like their subsistence product is rice, or like that they rely on rice very heavily in their diets.
Mm-hmm.
Yet competitive advantage says that they should produce cocoa beans or like cocoa for American markets or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we approach something like that where they are called to make something that doesn't necessarily provide them anything else but dollars to buy food, when there's potential hazards of perhaps like loss of an American market, like if we stop buying their product, and now they don't have anything to buy what they need to sustain themselves nutritionally.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we approach that as we give up other things? Or even for another example, our steel industry, when it's more beneficial to us to export our steel industry, yet there's national security risks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are definitely situations like this where we do have to weigh the efficiency standpoints versus whether there are in fact other considerations. And so as you've mentioned, national security, that is obviously one that should also be a factor. So we didn't, I'm not necessarily saying that efficiency should be the only consideration. Obviously, it is one that is a significant consideration. But if there are other contravening circumstances that would argue against that, which might possibly have a greater offsetting effect, then obviously we should pay attention to those as well and make an informed decision in light of all of those circumstances. Yes, please.
My question is, when it comes to a country as large as our own, or say India or China, even Russia, though it won't really apply to much of their territory, our country is very varied and highly, can't think of another term, but we have a great deal of different resources throughout our country. How do we organize efficiency for a country when so many sections of the country are so dynamically different, and much of the country is, like for instance, California, we have extremely good soil, and much of that soil has houses on it or what have you, is being used for other purposes. How do we organize efficiency when
Yeah, I think generally speaking, if we assume that markets are efficient, then we can apply the same concept to smaller and smaller geographic regions. And so I talked about nations specializing in those things in which they have the most natural resources. I don't think we have to limit that just to nations. We can break that down into these smaller geographic segments. And so using the examples that you gave, if California has resources in a certain area that then allow it to export to the other states in the country as well as to other nations, it can do that. And then if other states, for instance, the South historically as being an area that has been strong in cotton production, if they can specialize in that, then they can be primarily the region that handles cotton production, the Midwest being primarily the region that handles a lot of the wheat and other types of agricultural products. So I think we can definitely apply the same principles into smaller geographic segments.
I guess a follow-up to that would be, we have the ability to produce much, if not all, of what we need as a country to survive. Why would we want to kind of push that off into many other countries when we aren't taking advantage of our resources that are currently not being developed?
For example?
For example, agriculture has taken a great hit in the last half century.
Mm-hmm.
We used to produce a great deal of food. Now we're not producing anywhere near as much food as we need, or at least a lot of the food we're producing is going to waste because it's not actually economic to produce as much as they're producing.
Mm-hmm. And I suspect a degree of that may be due to government subsidies. This is one of the things that we can get into in economic discussions, is what is the role of government policies toward things like this. So if the government is subsidizing certain things and basically interfering with the natural market mechanism of the amount that should be produced at optimal prices and quantities, then perhaps we need to rethink some of those policies. I know this has been an ongoing debate in political elections for decades, is in this whole area of government subsidies to different areas of the agricultural sector and what impact that is having. So I think that's definitely an issue we would need to explore as well. Kelly.
I was wondering if you could speak, I'm Kelly. If you could speak for a moment about creation care concerns. What would it take, you mentioned cell phones and cars like in India, what would it take for the entire population of the world to drive a car or use a cell phone or drink a bottle of water or something like that? Like, just can you speak to that for a moment?
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly we have to look at the question of does every single person in the world even need all of those things? Some people, by virtue of lifestyle choices, may decide that these are things that they don't need. For instance, if you are in a smaller region of India where you don't really have long distances to travel for most of what you need in your day-to-day life, you may not need to have a car. It may be perfectly fine for you to have a bicycle or a motorbike or just walk even. And so same thing with cell phones. Do you actually need a cell phone based on where you are? And so we can then look at all of these issues pertaining to what do people need. And I think you raised this in another question in terms of wants versus needs. So we would have to have people looking at their own lives, examining the whole issue of what are the things that we need in our lives versus what are the things that are just wants in our lives, and maybe looking at what is the overall impact in that. So as an example, I've made certain choices in my life to do without certain things that many people would typically have. And so for me, those were just personal choices I made because I don't feel as though those are things that are of value to me. So I think we can then see that in many other places around the world. And to me, I think ultimately it should come down to having the freedom to be able to make those choices. And if we can have the freedom to make those choices, then I think it is overall beneficial to everyone concerned.
I had a question specifically to the United States and the role of globalization. You cited that India has a deep understanding of hard sciences and China's recent explosion in their economy. With what's going on in the United States and so much of our debt being owned by China and other countries, do you see us in the future falling from being a global economic superpower?
That is the great imponderable question that many people are trying to answer right now. It's definitely a risk that I can foresee, and I think it definitely calls for taking active measures to shore up our financial house, making sure that we don't continue to pile on debt upon debt upon debt that could potentially pose these types of issues that you've just raised. So yes, it is an area about which I am concerned. And what will happen in the long run, obviously, we don't know because we cannot yet say what the future governments of the United States will be doing in that area. But yes, it is definitely a valid point of concern.
My name is Thatcher. This is kind of a follow-up question. I'm curious what your thoughts are on maybe what our nation does have to offer in a global standpoint. You know, you talk about different countries have specific resources that they have to offer other worlds or other countries so they can be specific in those areas. The whole outsourcing, but I feel like everything here is being outsourced in many ways, and I feel like earlier in the century, we had a lot of ingenuity and there's a lot of inventions that came out of the U.S., but now I feel like we're running out of creativity, and that's like our main global resource, if you will. I'm wondering if you have any ideas of what we actually have to offer the world.
Well, just to name a couple of examples off the top of my head, obviously things like Google and Apple and a lot of the tech industries that we see have been things that have been developed here. Also, a lot of the medical developments that we see, especially in life-saving drugs and technologies, are things that have oftentimes been developed here. I've read stories of medical devices that we are able to use here that many socialized medicine countries, such as England, their government simply will not pay for those things. For instance, even cancer treatment drugs in Britain, the availability of cancer treatment drugs is subject to an analysis by the government board that rations medical care in terms of how much it will add to a person's life. And they basically make a hard calculation that if it costs more than, I think, something like $25,000 to extend a person's life by 6 months, they will not pay for that. Here in the US, we don't necessarily impose such cold calculations on whether we will or will not give life-saving treatment to patients. So I think those are some of the things I can think of from the top of my head, technology and medical innovation that I think we have to offer.
I had a follow-up question to my creation care question.
Mm-hmm.
It sounded to me like you said something like when we have freedom, we can make choices about how we care for the environment and such. And like I agree that it would be problematic to make policy about the environment that like forces people to do certain things given. The question is though, just on a fundamental level, it seems like we make choices that we're not aware of the impact they have on those around us.
Mm-hmm.
Around us. If we look at desertification and the water crisis, erosion of topsoil, there's a lot of different things that are going on. Carbon emissions are probably exponentially higher. And it seems like we're given freedoms that are easily abused,
Mm-hmm.
and we're not always even aware of what we're doing and what we do when we drive our car every day and such. So I don't know if you can comment on that at all.
Yeah, there's definitely an education component, and so not every aspect of the conservation movement is an inherent evil. I think there is definitely a role for education and information about what is the impact of certain choices that we make. I think where we sometimes get into difficulty is when we become so fanatical about it that we almost want to dictate to people what they can or cannot do, rather than presenting information in a thoughtful and educational manner about here are what are some of the things these choices would possibly do, and maybe here are some better ways that, that potentially we can do that. So I definitely see the tension between trying to be good stewards of the resources and creation that God has given us versus also having the freedom and liberty that goes with that. So it's not an easy question to answer by any means. Yes, Kevin.
Just a curiosity, you touched briefly, very quickly on the end about Germany and their economic structure being unhappy basically with Greece's abuse of their finances, and we've obviously had our own here in this country. My curiosity is, where do you find our Christian values actually mixed with the capitalist kind of structure? Where do those actually lead us towards in terms of allowing companies or countries to not fail, or where do we have to draw the line in terms of saving people or companies? Or I'm kind of just curious about that, because I mean, Iceland went bankrupt, but nobody really cared about it. But we had two giant companies that now have put our country in a massive debt crisis. And so it's kind of, I mean, we're called to serve one another, but we're also called to be wise with the things that God's given us. Kind of interested in your thoughts about that.
Well, one example of ways in which I believe we can see in our country Christian values integrated with business is in terms of actual companies that seek to operate on that very model. Chick-fil-A comes to mind as a classic example of a company that tries to run its business on distinctly Christian principles, and it has been a pretty successful financial company. So I think, especially with this whole area, as we've seen in the wake of this first decade of the 21st century with all of the business scandals, Enron and others that took place, there has been a renewed emphasis on integrity and ethics in business. So I think this provides the perfect opportunity, as Chuck Colson was talking about in his essay of morality and commerce, for us as Christians to be able to reassert the importance of morality in commerce. We've seen the effects of what commerce without morality results in with companies like Enron and MCI. And so I think there has never been a better time than now for us as Christians to be able to say, here's what running a business with an ethical foundation would look like, and I believe these are things that we need to be doing in our society. Yes, Neil, I'll have you be the last question.
Oh, thank you. Actually, it's more of a comment. My name's Neil. I'm a guest here. You mentioned that with respect to the benefits of globalization, people in other countries are able to make their lives better in their own homes or in their own communities without having to uproot themselves. It would seem to me that Americans in general have personal problems with globalization's benefits due to our heritage of immigration in order to better our lives and ourselves. What do you think about that? Or am I off the mark?
Expand on that a little bit. So what aspect of immigration do you see as being problematic in this?
What I mean to say is that we have a historic buildup of our country from immigration from mainly Europe, but also Asia and Africa. And so it is very much the American dream here to immigrate to this, or to have people immigrate to this country, or at least it has been, in order to make a better life for themselves because of the amount of opportunity that we have here. So more elaborate.
Okay. So yes, I think that is part of what we see as the historical distinction between the US and other countries, is that by virtue of the heritage we had being built on such a distinctly Christian foundation, there were things that were available here that would not have been available in these other countries. And so for that reason, especially in eras when there was a lot more tyranny and oppression in many of these other countries around the world, people definitely did want to emigrate to the United States or other Western countries in hopes of having a better life for themselves and their families. But I think as we are seeing now, with the development of liberalization and companies being able to provide good jobs, and even governments starting to liberalize in certain places, whether we still need to have as much immigration to Western countries is a subject that's open for discussion. And I'm not sure that we can necessarily answer that question so quickly here tonight. But definitely we are seeing that the need for it, I think, is diminishing in some respects.